You said something in the first half that I want to take up again, which is that for Kurz, the question is, even if the pie is getting higher, as George Bush would say, which in a malapropism, we have more people today than we did before. Therefore, even if the ratio of middle class people increases in number, the absolute number of poor people is also increasing.
Yes.
And what would his counter be to someone who says, well, give it time? We're going to close that gap.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Nick Gruber, that's how I'm going to say your name. Did I get that correct?
Grubernick or Nick Gruber. I constantly shy away from naming myself Nick Gruber because we have a chanson singer here who's like almost the same name. It doesn't have any implication.
No relation. Okay.
No relation.
Well, but you are the translator for Robert Kurz. Is that correct?
I have been on this project of translating that book that hadn't been translated, which got me into big trouble because I kept talking to people like they were already aware of his body of work, which they weren't, and then everything is kind of people that just don't understand this at all. I'm not that's the thing that I just cannot avoid, I guess, is being equated with the Robert Kurz guy. But I wouldn't say I'm one of the value theorist Marxists.
No,
I'd say I'm much more of a Marxist-Leninist, as we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Much less of, as I wrote in that short letter, maybe we should talk about this afterwards. Yeah. I don't know, but he threw feces at everybody, and that included my faction. But it's not the same kind of feces that he threw at the liberals and the liberal conservatives.
Okay, but Robert Kurz was a value theory Marxist.
He was basically the founder of this entire thing. Basically, I think I can venture to say, yeah.
Would you say that Moïse Pastone was a co-founder, or was Moïse Pastone influenced by him? Or
I'm not super in. I know Moïse Pastone. I know that he was mentioned very often, but he was much more in the so that's that caricature of Adorno that you guys have after this long study that he made, right? What's the authoritarian personality? And then we just check off all the traits, and yes, this is a proto-fascist right there.
Mm-hmm.
Kurz wasn't that at all, and I think reading this book should clarify and obfuscate at the same time, right?
Well, when you say Marxist-Lenin, that you're a Marxist-Leninist, what do you mean? Because that's synonymous with Stalinism in certain circles. So
that's true.
You're not claiming to be a Stalinist, are you? When you
No, I wouldn't. Of course, I'm I'm happily sitting on the fence, being a good left liberal Westerner like yourself. So
yes. Okay. So what would you say? When you hear the word Stalinist, what does that mean in contemporary discourse? What does it mean to be a Stalinist today? You think?
So I've been reading Slavoj Žižek's work also, as many other people Not every book, which is quite impossible, but the big ones. The first one, the sublime object of ideology. Let's say the parallax view, and then the big thick black one, less than nothing. These are the corner poles. And he makes this argument against Stalin. He says the old sophist Gorgias, from the Platonic dialogue, he was the arch Stalinist, in that we are going to have this perfect, unified, singular, one-voiced call of the people, and he's just a supreme servant of the people. That's why he's clapping all the time. When people are applauding him, he's joining in, and while the fascists, we know they just take it in, right? Corroborate it. So what's a Stalinist? A Stalinist is, if we take that show trial example, is the one that speaks through the objective will of the people, right? But he isn't this objective will. He's just this enforcer or primary servant of the objective will, and that speaks through the organ of his person as the leader of the party, right? So, but it's the key insight here is the difference between the fascists and the Stalinists, right? Do they join in? Do they see themselves as servant of a supreme will, or are they in that metaphysical camp, in that the wound that Carl Schmitt opened up, that liberal constitutions just cannot, how should I put it? Liberal constitutions cannot create this entirety of this whole thing. I'm paraphrasing.
Okay, but if it were the case that Stalin was merely the enactor and the enforcer of the general will or the common will, or I'm not sure I would oppose such a leader. And also, I'm not sure I could see the difference between Stalin, who claps along, and Biden or
he would
Obama.
clap along too, I guess.
Yeah. Or any democratically elected leader who claimed rightly that his power or her power came from the will of the people.
Wouldn't Putin say something like this?
Perhaps. I mean, I don't know if Putin would clap along or just soak in the applause, but certainly most democratically elected leaders who have term limits and who understand that they're going to be replaced by some other figure who will enforce the general will, that they are not what's important, but rather the process of democratic participation is what's important, would fit within that model, would be the Stalinists. So it seems to me that, if you take Robert Kurz up, that the difference between a socialist and a bourgeois Bonapartist leader is that the socialist understands that in order to, or certainly the Marxist understands that in order to actually enact the will of the people, you'll have to first overcome a set of social relations that mediate that will and that alienate the population from themselves and their own power. As long as we're producing the world in an effort to reproduce value to increase the abstract labor time that exists in the world, then we are not actually able to obtain our general will, which would, go beyond that abstraction. In fact, what we create is quite literally alienated from us through the market, we are exploited by our own system of production and distribution. So it seems to me that the Stalinist enacting the general will in a revolutionary way would have to be enacting the will of the proletariat as they transform the means of production and the social relationships of production into a new form. It wouldn't just be a matter of even giving them democratic control over the working day as it exists now, or over commodity production. So in any case,
just say state capitalism, right?
Yeah, it wouldn't be state capitalism.
Shouldn't be. Yeah,
it shouldn't be. But we can imagine a Stalinist figure that would plod along in a process of revolutionary change too, if he was actually embodying and enforcing the general will for radical transformation.
Right.
So I don't know.
We bring Robert Kurz here because I personally, the Marxist-Leninists are, of course, staying here and say, yes, Douglas Lain, you're quite right. And it's a good thing we're not in power. But Robert,
why is it a good thing that they're not in power?
Because we get to do these YouTube conversations, right? And
if you were in discussion. Wait, are you saying if you were in power, then I would be in Gulag? Is that what you're saying? Well,
I would, of course, be a good Stalinist and accuse myself and say I've been a bourgeois from the very start, and I am the supreme instrument of obfuscation. Right there. I accuse myself. Yes.
In my fantasies of what will happen after the revolution, I do imagine myself eating boiled cabbage and gulag. And writing.
Can we move to Robert Kurz? Can we?
Okay. Go.
He has an easy way out of this. For him, as I wrote in that letter, maybe I can paraphrase myself right there. But I think it wasn't too bad. So for him, this is liberalism itself is a Bentanian penitentiary institution that Bentham as that catchword that kind of encapsulates this closed cybernetic system. You have production on the one side and you have consumption on the other, and everybody's happy. Then the liberal entry of this, there is no losing trade, right? Because even if you are on the side of the one that doesn't gain as much as the other side, you gained. Otherwise, you wouldn't have entered into that trade relationship in the first place. So if you add that in, the pie needs to grow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the working class was constructed through primitive accumulation, and there wasn't much of an option for people. They either join the working class or they starved. But yes, nonetheless, continue.
So for him, the totalitarian management of people, as he often put it in the book, is a kind of a defining feature of democracy and liberalism. Mm-hmm. That's a key. There's a totalitarian element right there from the start, and he makes his case from Hobbes.
Say that again. I think I may have missed it. Say that one more time.
There's a totalitarian element in the liberal market democracy itself, which means that that this circle is placed upon us, and there is no access. In fact, because it did, as I just said, we can always just not trade, and somebody else will. And as a whole, the nominalist answer, as Zizek would have said, it doesn't matter what the individual relations are like. There's going to emerge one relation that is going to be dominant, and that's one is going to drive history forward, and then we are going to approach this culmination where where all contradictions are solved, right? Where this closed circle actually works out for us. I'm not sure if I put this rightly, but the whole Zizekian project and the liberal project, and with culminating in that late Schelling, right? In that, okay, there is, or let's say Lacan, there is an absolute negativity. There's a place we cannot go, and we have to work around this in some way. This is something that the Stalinists just wouldn't accept.
Mm-hmm. And what is that absolute negativity for Kurz?
He doesn't jump into this that much. He cuts across this before that. For him, liberalism and the market relation is already a totality, right? There's no, of course, you can abstractly negate your colluding in that system, but it doesn't matter because you're going to be spat out anyway, and somebody else is going to take your place, and the whole system keeps rotating. Mm-hmm. For him, some like a left liberal like Keynes, I think he had a knack for great titles. He quoted Keynes, "Let's build pyramids and dig holes. Build pyramids and dig holes." That's about it. Why? Because we just need to be, he ties in Protestant ethic in this. He says, devil's hands are idle hands are the devil's workshop, stuff like this. Mm-hmm. That to him, that already was totalitarian domination of people right there. And he says this quite openly. With Marx, a negative and an affirmative notion of work constantly blur into one another. And the labor market Marxists took on just one half of this.
Well, would he say that, under subsistence farming, right, in agricultural life, when most of the work done is domestic work, done to sustain yourself,
right,
and only a limited amount is actually put into the market, was that kind of work which was not alienated from the family and not alienated from the worker, but used to produce the things that they needed to survive, was that totalitarian as well? Was that enforced upon? Was that a burden or a kind of exploitation, or is that preferable?
To be quite honest, he starts his history in the Middle Ages, in European Middle Ages. So the primitive accumulation, he just omitted, right, to have that historical genealogy. He plainly said, so in the 15s or 1600s, a carpenter would get they would use rye equivalents to calculate what they got, and they would get 20 kilos of rye for an honest day of work. And 200 years later, it was 6 kilograms. That's it. That's the basic. He just challenged that the market economy is fundamentally welfare enhancing, because the great majority, because of course, if you cherry pick certain stats, you will have great outliers and you will have greater numbers of people being lifted out of poverty. But his argument was, yes, but we have 9 billion people now. Are you telling me that we have less losers than when we had 4 billion people? That's it, basically, right? So we quadrupled both the winners and the losers. But if you quadruple 5 billion people or 7 billion people, you get a much larger absolute number out of this. And that's the start of this argument, as I understood it, after many, many times reading it. So he goes a little bit against.
So he advocates for localism and small-scale production and against the socialization of production through mass production and industrialization. He's against all of that, right?
Oh yeah. He was a councilist, a proper Rosa Luxemburgish councilist. So,
but
all
Rosa
the power
Luxemburg
should
wasn't
be
against industrial production. She was for workers' control.
right.
But so, and the councils aren't necessarily saying, well, we need to create the big councils. You're talking about the political form that organizing production will take, but you're not talking about whether or not people are primarily subsistence farmers or whether or not there's a exchange between regions or, how much is being produced.
I have just the right text quote from Kurz answering that very question.
Okay.
He said, Rosa Luxemburg in particular embodied everything that the capitalist consciousness in general and the consciousness of the crisis in particular hated to the core: the Jewish, the foreign Polish, the feminine in a form that wasn't even pet-like, a theorist, and the left radicalism with its vague memory of the future of an unthinkable liberation from the system of abstract labor. As I haven't mentioned this, this is kind of a supposition. We have concretely labor and abstract labor. I think you have explained that distinction many times over. We don't need to do that again.
No.
So he said Rosa Luxemburg was certainly caught up in the bourgeois categories of the labor movement Marxism. Of course, she could not simply jump out of a long history of domesticating oppositional thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But with its theory of an objective inner limit to the capitalist system and the necessity and the necessary self-activity of the masses, it came closest of all to contemporary positions to the radical critique of the beautiful machine that Bentham Burt, together with its political administration of people. That is why, with compelling consequence, it was the first act of democracy, mighty as it always was, to smash the skull of this 49-year-old woman with a rifle butt by Freischärten, German veterans from World War I. So he excluded her labor market Marxism from this entire thing because she basically said there's an inner limit, and that's central to Kurz's argument. It's also the source of the schism within the value theorist Marxists, which happened in 2004 or so. That's when the group around Heinrich broke off from the Kurz group. Kurz called this a putsch. Right?
Is it the value form theorists or the value theorists? Is there a difference? I know there's a value form theory, and then there's
I think I'm on thin ice here. I'd say it's
fair enough.
Value form, neue Wertkritik, neue Marx-Lektüre, they called it. So I'm not sure how they translated this. Just a new Marx, like reading Marx anew from the 90s onwards, with Michael Heinrich of obviously being a shooting star of the late 90s, early 2000s, when he was a young mathematician.
Well, let me describe to you what I think Marx believed about what would be necessary in order to create communism, and you can compare it to what Kurz believes, maybe, and what Kurz believed Marx believes. Because I think Marx believed that a working class revolution to transform not the market, but the way in which the social relationships around production, which would then also transform the kind of technological assets that the working class held on to, would lead to the creation of enough abundance that the necessity for a mediating value for exchange would fall away. From reading the Critique of the Gotha program, he talks about that.
See, you're on my side.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
I accept this. I swallow it, hook, line, and sink. Yes, you guys say.
Right. So, but nonetheless, Marx does this by pointing out the ways in which maximizing a particular form of value, which has to do with maximizing abstract labor time, leads to contradictions and cuts against the creation of true abundance in irrational ways we can see now. And I think he saw it then, leads to crisis. And whether or not that crisis will be terminal, we can put that aside. And that only through the organization of the working class to transform their own activity would something like socialism, let alone communism, be possible. And that wasn't about escaping from useful work of all kinds. It was about escaping from a particular kind of work, which could be turned into capital, which is a social formation and not just a physical action, right? It's so that's my understanding of the Marxist project is to.
For me, it was always the Schafe hüten, Fische fangen, Bücher kritisieren. The tending sheep, catching fish, and criticizing books at the end of the day, without being a fisherman or a sheep herder or a professional book criticizer.
Right, and that could be possible because the work that was being done to reproduce society would be so efficient and would be aimed at providing for society itself, so that you wouldn't need to slave away all day to reproduce yourself. You would have lots of free time.
Right.
So it would be a freedom from labor by transforming labor, not simply by returning to subsistence farming or private production.
That's Kurtz's starting point, by the way, because why didn't that happen? Why hasn't that abundance come about? Why isn't it always limited to certain segments or certain regions of the world? All that welfare enhancing effect of the market economy.
What do you think the answer is to that question?
I personally, I think wrong people have been in power, but for Kurz, it was baked into liberalism itself, right there, right from the beginning.
See, my answer would be that because we haven't actually had a revolutionary politics to transform production, we have continued to reproduce the social forms of called capital, and capital tends to go into crisis, and therefore it creates an uneven kind of development, puts nations into competition with each other, not just in the level of who can trade more, but also like who's going to have political control over resources, and those resources can include forms of production or factories and so forth. And so, and we can see that clearly over the last, let's say, 15 years, from 2008 to today. The causes for conflict between China and the United States, for example, have to do with the way in which the economic crisis of 2008 has been shifted around. And now we're at a point where some nation or another is going to have to take the hit, be set back, and for their capital to be devalued. And the question is, who's it going to be? That's how I look at it. And so,
really,
when that
think
happens,
the entire nation gets it. But yeah.
Obviously, the entire nation doesn't. Like, not every individual in the nation gets hit, but you'll see a total devaluation of capital. Some people, as individuals, will be winners in that process, but the total value of capital will go down. They'll have an economic collapse. They'll have, their ability to reproduce themselves will be destroyed until some capitalist or another, perhaps a foreign one, will come along and buy up everything they have real cheap. So, I mean, that is if they haven't physically destroyed it. That's another way to devalue capital. But that would be my explanation as to why.
That reminds me, this is very close to your compatriot Frederick Jameson, who said wars wars is basically the function of capital destruction.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You could perhaps make that case. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I think. But what was Kurz's explanation for why because it's baked into liberalism, not into capitalism or into production or into the value form, but rather into the idea of democracy and mass production itself?
I think the common element is, it's a good thing that you mentioned this, because I get to mention Michael Heinrich in a positive way, because he had this line that already I think it was in Locke, right? The constitutional liberalism. The produce of the servant was already priced into the master's produce right there from the start. So whatever we are talking about, non-alienated work, it stopped prior to, let's say, the master and his flock of people that he tended to, his retainers, right?
So you're saying that the serf was already being alienated from his labor because it was
in liberalism. This distinction didn't even come into mind, right at the start. Yes, he was already alienated in that way that he worked on the estate of his what's the other side of the retainer, the Lehnsherr, the aristocrat or something.
Right. The aristocrat's land. He would work on the lord's land, cultivate crops, take a portion of those crops for himself, and give a portion to the lord. Right.
Give the entire thing to the lord and take a portion for himself. Yes.
Well,
that's the.
Yeah, I mean, if you give the entire thing to the Lord and then take a portion for yourself, then you haven't given the entire thing to the Lord.
Right.
But I mean, you could say it differently. He gave the entire thing to the Lord, and then the Lord.
He had a lease on the land. Some had a lease. Some were part of the land or something, right? But that's a relatively recent development. I think, at least here in my country, Austria. I think they had this in the 1850s, in the aftermath of 1848, when they, let's say, socialized the land, which was divided. We have many mountains here, for the large forested areas, and these forests were kept into the property, were kept to the property of the aristocrats, but all the flat land where you could actually farm, that went to the farmers, who had to have a lease to the state or something, and the rich ones even owned their own land. But that was kind of the difference, right? But in any way, whoever worked on behest of the farmers was alienated from his own labor, because he wasn't working into his own pockets to apply that liberal terminology.
I mean, Marx would say, but that that the theft from the serf was social. It was direct. It was known. The hierarchical relationship was established. The serf wasn't free to work just anywhere.
Right.
The serf didn't have any legal rights outside of or certainly not the same legal rights as the lord. Whereas in a capitalist society, it's the freedom of the worker to work anywhere he pleases that sets up abstract labor to begin with, because the laborer and the capitalist both rely on the market and exchange to survive and reproduce themselves, rather than growing food enough for himself and the feudal lord. The worker produces whatever the capitalist wants, and then gets a wage which he can use to purchase what he needs to survive in the market. It's a very different relationship, and the fact that he doesn't get as much as the boss or the capitalist, to put it more clearly, isn't the problem. That's just a technical fact of
right. That's Marcuse right there. It's the control that matters. The control of the productive forces.
Right. It's the control of the productive forces, but also the fact that the abstract labor, the production of abstract labor, and the commodity form itself is in contradiction with itself and goes into crisis. The fact that rather than aiming at producing useful things for the world, for society, even, or for the capitalist, what's being aimed at is to produce the money form, right? And this abstraction, which is quite apart. You could be wealthy, like you could live in Greece during around 2010 and have $1 million or euros in your bank account, but go out into the street to find, to buy groceries, and there's nothing on the fucking shelf. And you could.
That's a Hayek argument, by the way. Right? We've have plenty of money, but nothing to eat. Right?
That's right. or vice versa. You could be. Yanis Varoufakis talked about this. He had a best-selling book in Greece right around the time of the economic crisis, and he never got paid. Not because he didn't sell a million copies. He did. But because all the bookstores that were selling his book were going under and not paying their bills and going bankrupt. So the publisher never got paid. So he couldn't get paid, even though the people who had money were spending it on his book. It just wasn't working out in the total system. So you have this, things are not direct.
You open just a big can of worms right there when you put writing books into that commodity.
Yeah, right. Okay. I don't mean to put books in there because that's property relations and not commodity relations. But nonetheless, the point is that things you can create what is needed, and you can create a whole bunch of. Let's put it differently. Like during the pandemic, they produced a huge amount of milk in America, and then they just dumped it all down the drain. Because the price was too low if they had used all that milk to actually give people something to drink.
Yes. We have a regional variant of the same story here. We have this, we have conscript army, big state institutions, just purely defensive, but they were allocated a specific budget for milk. They would do exactly what you just said. They would put it down the drain so that they can get in the same amount next year, because if they hadn't used it all up, they would just get less. Right.
So the point is that we have a system that's in contradiction with itself, where where what's useful and what's actually financially or what actually is like, there's two kinds of wealth. There's useful wealth and abstract wealth dominates useful wealth. So we have a system which is at odds with itself. It's contradiction with itself, and the task of the revolution is to overcome that contradiction. Maybe not every contradiction, and so I don't know. I mean, I guess what I'm getting at with all this regurgitation of what is for me dogma is that I would have expected Kurz to be speaking a little more like I am now than to be talking about democracy.
You're speaking very much like a Hegelian right there, or like a Marxist, let's say, mutually interacting contradictions, all that. That's not part of Kurz's lingo, but
it's not.
It's due to the time. He was writing in 1990 after the fall of the Soviet Union, right? So there was no audience for proper historical materialism, or now that we reinvention dialectical materialism, right? That just wasn't. He would have, I guess.
How could he write about value without writing about these kinds of contradictions that Marx describes in Capital between, like, say, use value and abstract value? How could he write about value without writing about value in a Marxist sense? Was he not meaning it in a Marxist sense?
Oh, of course he was. Of course he was. But remember, he saw abstract work as a fetish right there from the start. It's like you know that David Graeber example of the New York artistry or atelier or exhibition, and there's a lady sitting in front where nobody ever shows up, but you need to have that lady, because otherwise you're not an exhibition. So how do you subjectivize being in a job that you actually don't need to fulfill anything? You're just filling up a slot. And Robert Kurz would say, yes, that's because it's a fetish right there. That's abstract work.
Yeah, but when Marx wrote about the commodity fetish, he didn't mean it as the same kind of fetish that a shoe fetishist has or something like that. He meant that it actually has a real impact on the world. That this has become not just an ideology in someone's head, but a material fact in the world, and that's how the commodity is a fetish.
Can I read snippet 29? I think
read that.
We read it. It's the same one that we had last time. Anyway, snippet 29, social democracy. This approach was rooted in liberalism's positivistic, technical, scientifically abbreviated concept of progress, and that had its consequences. Along with more or less uncritically understood technological form of the factory system, liberalism's abstract concept of work, which it had inherited from Protestantism, and the absolutist regimes in which it had refined, there's a better word, anyway, which it had refined in a Protestant manner, in a capitalist manner, was also largely adopted. Marx actually meant the concept of abstract labor critically, but by no means clearly demarcated it from an affirmative understanding. With him, a critical and a positive concept of work constantly blur into one another. And in the reading of the Marxism of the workers' movement, this became a positive glorification of Protestant work virtue. And in the textbooks of the GDR, paradoxically, abstract labor became an economic state doctrine. Let me just briefly intersect. There's this one anecdote from the GDR, and I'm really not opposed to them. Let's reaffirm Marxist Leninism. But anyway, talking about Stalinism.
Let's all be Stalinism. Okay.
So they had in West Berlin, they had IKEA stores, and they would have this really cheap IKEA racks. Not sure what the name is in America, but a really cheap rack. And since the GDR was lacking so many raw commodities where they needed foreign currency to purchase it on the open market, what they had was state-induced labor power, right? So what ended up happening was in the GDR, there were people assembling those racks, those IKEA racks that would later be sold in West Berlin. And the GDR would get those foreign funds to what's the MMT word, to furnish itself or to provision itself, right? The state.
So they became manufacturers of IKEA furniture, even though the whole idea of IKEA is that you build it at home. Is that right?
That's not those specific racks, right? But yeah.
Okay. So
yeah, really, maybe they sewn the wooden planks or something.
Yeah, but in order for the GDR to have enough capital to keep its economy afloat, it had to rely on trade. Right. So yeah. And
they needed exports in some way or fashion, and their export was labor power, right?
But that was and why was that necessary? Because it's not because they were going to keep the goods that you manufactured. They didn't have it wasn't a matter of useful stuff or raw materials or even manufactured goods in the GDR, but it was
they wanted capital, right? They needed foreign currency to conduct open market operations, to provision themselves, to buy what they didn't have, because it's a smaller area than West Germany.
Because on the level of abstract labor, or the level of value, or just on the financial level, they were beset with difficulties. They had debt, or something like that, and in order to overcome their debt, they had to make money from foreign markets. But they weren't taking that money they spent from foreign markets and spending it on imports, were they? They were spending it on things manufactured there.
Of course they imported stuff of raw materials so that the economy could be kept afloat, and
right. Okay.
The level that they thought that the state would needed, that was settled.
But yeah, well, okay. So what's the big revelation here? What am I supposed to say is so strange about this? That a communist country was relying on trade and abstract. I mean, we knew that. That was like that. If you're like me and you listen to the Forrest Johnson tendency, you know that and hell, even if you just listen to Lenin, you know that that no country, including the communist ones, have ever even obtained socialism, which is as a transition to communism, like a new form of economy.
Right.
They've always in the Soviet Union, the aim was to break from the old autocratic rule from the Tsar and create capital, the liberal bourgeois capitalist society, rather than to and break away from the old monarchy. And then once they've done that, after revolution in Germany, then they could create socialism, as the next step, I think. But that never happened. So Germany was only communist through colonialism. What was Kurz's point about the GDR with West Germany?
That little anecdote that I just reproduced would corroborate Kurz's point in that capitalism is a fetishistically motivated human material totalitarian system that could not emerge outside of a democratic liberal state. Right there, that would be Kurz's argument, and the criticism that he leveled towards the, let's say, state socialist regimes of the East was kind of the same criticism that he leveled towards the liberals in the West. So there's not much difference. He was against the idea that people should have to work. Let me briefly intersect a little story.
Go ahead. I
have a small niece, 11 years old, and I asked her what she was up to in school, and she said, there's this art teacher, that female art teacher walks around the classroom and then just rudely draws on people's sheets of paper, and then she walks over to the next desk, right? And then she kind of made the segue to her music teacher, who kind of the same type of personality. And then I asked her, but what do you like to do in your spare time? And she said, draw and sing. Exactly the same thing, right? So he was onto something. We just love to do this if we're not fremdbestimmt, if we're not guided by others to do this, alienated, as you said, right?
Right. Okay. So, but his point about the IKEA manufacturing IKEA furniture was
that's my anecdote. Let's not put that into the Kurz.
That's your anecdote.
I got it from a different point. You can certainly look it up, but it wasn't in one of Kurz's books. But he made his point.
Okay, that you had to create alienated work in order to sustain the economy.
They were a small country on a global scale. They were propped up by the East, by the Soviet Union. That's why it dissolved immediately when the Berlin Wall came down, when the Soviet Union dissolved. Also, as the West put it, the vassal state in East Germany could cease to exist. So there was never any Vietnam, national communism, something.
Okay. All right. So, why are you translating Kurz? It seems like you're a critic of him more than you are an admirer.
Right. Yeah. Shit. I translate. Personally, I was just shocked last July when I saw that the book, although it came out in 1999, it hadn't been translated in 23 years.
Was he very influential in the German left?
Yeah, somewhat. Yes. The value, it was always the highest form of not being a left liberal, but still a left winger without being labor movement Marxist. So you had somebody who's deeply influenced by Marx, but did not go into the state doctrinal labor market Marxism. In fact, he was very critical of it. In my translation, I even cut down on this a little bit, but it's still there, a lot of it. But yes. So my motivation was to fill that gap, right? It wasn't, in the end, this is not going to clarify anything. In fact, it's only going to make this more complicated, but it's against this easy, yes, we are the liberal enlightened left on the West, and then we have these dark regimes in the East, which always rang so wrong to me, right? Also with Zizek and his constant, because he's really okay with, if they become fascists, then okay, this is their decision. But I never trusted Fidel Castro, and I never trusted the guys who run Venezuela, right? These are the wrong guys. But yeah, with the fascists, it's kind of, it doesn't have to be fascism. It doesn't have to be. This is, how did they put it? The intellectual laziness on the left, when you immediately say this is fascism, or you have to add liberal fascism to it, right? There's this meme with the rainbow flag colored military boot stepping on people, right? So something like this.
I kind of think that when you were criticizing Castro, say, or Hugo Chavez, you're not doing it.
I wouldn't. He was, yes.
Okay, right. When anyone who calls themselves a socialist or a leftist criticizes Castro, they are criticizing Castro not because by saying, "Oh, this is the worst form of government possible. He is absolutely an enemy of the left. He is, no. The question is, do we want to model our struggle on Castro's model, and is Castro the horizon for revolutionary change? Whereas if you're talking about Putin or Erdogan or Trump, the question is this actually fascism? It's a different question. It's not. No one thinks that Trump represents the revolution, right? No one thinks this is the horizon of our political possibilities. What we're being asked to do when we oppose Trump is to say we need to align with progressive capital, with the Democratic Party, with the so-called liberal, but I'll say progressive state, in order to oppose Trump, because the fascist threat is the worst threat around. And what someone like Slovoy would say is this really fascism? Is this the same as the Nazi threat, which justified a popular front? Is it? And if it isn't, then how do we think about the populist, statist forms of capitalism, which have something like a dictator at the top, like Putin. How do we approach that, and how do we differentiate it from Xi in China? How do we think through? I mean, because some people would want to put China as the horizon of our revolutionary ambition right now, or at least the direction that we need to go in. And so that's why he's like, is it fascism? Are they really fascists? I don't know. Why don't we not intervene in that sovereign nation? But then he'll say, but Castro, I never trusted, because he's not suggesting he supports the U.S. invasion of Cuba. He's saying, I don't think that Castro is the end goal for communists. That doesn't mean that I agree with Zizek's vision of socialism. I don't. In many ways, I don't. But I definitely, what I would say is I agree with Zizek's approach to trying to struggle with dialectical thinking and political engagement.
I wouldn't have read most of the German idealist tradition in the German original if it hadn't been for that Slovene writing this in English for me, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
This is
right.
It is just the teacher, the funny teacher that we all love. So
yeah, that's how I feel about him too. Listen, we've been recording for about an hour. I want to keep you around for at least a little while longer, but I want to talk about. But I'm going to break. This is the next part is for people.
Can I just
go ahead?
Can I just what Robert Kurz work reminded me of was Michael Moore and his dealing with Flint, Michigan, and the destruction of this way of life, right? Which got Moore into his project. That's what this reminded me of. It's the perspective of the downtrodden for a change.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not talking about the winners, talking about the winners lifting everybody up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
No, we're talking about the huge masses of losers we are producing.
Right. Well, let me start with that now, because I want to do the Patreon part. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.